this is dangerous, being there were people living in this the people living in this building were doing so illegally, and they could get rough with people who weren't part of their group. But his dad uses a crowbar, forces his way into the pitch black building. It's cold, with just a little flashlight. He eventually finds an area where Shan's stuff is, but not Shan. His father posted signs around the fort saying that they were looking for Shan, and even left a note for Shan on his things, pleading with him to contact them. So his family continues to persist but still Shan's parents were able to identify him right there at the scene as one of the bodies was indeed their son. So then the investigation goes to the actual fort where Shan had lived. When police entered the building, again, this is a former warehouse, so it's huge, they find a mess. Pretty much everything from the former business, that this former business had been abruptly shut down by the government, so there were file cabinets, papers, all kinds of stuff, paper, tools, furniture. It was a mess. There were holes in the wall, down ceiling tiles from the roof failing, broken windows. The people who had been living in the building had been using buckets as toilets, and then dumping the contents of those makeshift toilets into one room on the first floor. So you have a biohazard going on in there. Police then find Shan's living area, and they see dark spots on the walls around by his bed, and this was blood. And an officer then finds a jacket of Shan's near his bed and lifts it, and there's even more blood. As they go through more of the building, they find more blood by the front entrance and, importantly, an almost perfect boot print in blood by the door. So eventually, the second victim, who was in the manhole with Shan, was identified as Mike Lawson, his friend. Both Shan and Mike were found to have had massive injuries to their heads, their necks, their chests, their shoulders, and Shan had defensive marks on his arms. The pathologist report suggested that their injuries were from a hammer or a club-like weapon due to the small, circular wounds that they had on them. So next, the guy I mentioned, Don, who was like the scrapping coordinator, Don contacts the police. He says he knows Shan and Mike, who are now both deceased, and he also says he knows Brian Talboom, Brian is still missing. Don offers to help police search other manholes. Again, the manholes are dangerous and complex, and Don knew his way around them, so police took him up on it. So on January 12th, police find a manhole, and the cover is on upside down. upstairs. Randy and Daniel were on the first floor. Shan, Brian, Jason, Mike were on the second floor. And Daniel said that they could hear them laughing, drinking. They could hear the propane heater running. And as they sat there and listened to this, they just got angrier and angrier. So the next day, Randy grabbed a pipe and Daniel grabbed a hammer. And they went to confront Shan and Mike. They found Mike passed out with vodka by him. And Shan was reading a magazine. Daniel then swung at Shan, and Randy beat an already unconscious Mike with the pipe. Shan fought back, but ultimately couldn't withstand the strength of two very angry men. Randy and Daniel then left Shan and Mike for dead, and went and hid in another part of the building and lie in wait for Jason Coates and Brian Talboom to return so they could confront them. When Jason and Brian came back, Randy and Daniel attacked and killed them too. Daniel said that later they heard moaning a couple hours later, and they discovered that Shan was still alive, so Randy Reeder then dealt final blows to kill him off. My throat. Police said Daniel showed absolutely no remorse in recounting the story. He recounted it very sterilely. No remorse. And he said he didn't even know any of these guys. He just very callously said he didn't know any of them. And he thought he absolutely had a right to do what he did to kill them because they went through his stuff. Daniel, that night, after the killings, slept in the fort with the bodies of 4 men he helped to kill. Randy left. He left for about a week, and then when he came back, he wanted to clean up the fort. So he said when Randy came back about a week later, they disposed of the bodies by strapping them to stretchers they found amidst the junk in the building. It took them about 6 hours to dispose of all the bodies in the dark, so they weren't seen doing it. They tossed the murder weapons and some personal belongings of the victims into the river. Randy was eventually found and arrested and convicted of the 4 murders. He maintained his innocence in court, even though he confessed to a cellmate. Randy actually requested the death penalty for himself, which he didn't end up getting, but he ended up sentenced to 260 years in prison. And Daniel pled guilty and was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Daniel and Randy were in their 50s at the time, so they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. On a personal note to all this, I worked in downtown South Bend at that time of the murders, and I used to walk by Randy Reeder a lot downtown, one of the murderers. He would often be standing in this doorway to this other abandoned building that was on kind of like the main drag downtown. And I remember I thought he kind of looked like Santa Claus. He had a beard, kind of blondish with some gray in it. He was often in a snowsuit, a tan snowsuit, and he'd often have a white hat on and this big red bag she